Hello and welcome to Reimagining Entrepreneurship. I'm Professor Edgell. Today, in our final official lesson of this course in Module 4-1, I'm going to try to address this issue of evolving the venture. And that is, how do we go about growing the venture? And in particular, I want to answer these questions. And I'm going to start with a very, very big social question. And that is, how might we reimagine how we grow economies? It's a very big question. I want to try to tackle that and give you my thoughts on it. Then I'm going to hone in on the actual ventures and try to answer these two questions. What are the phases and challenges of growing a venture? And then how might one go about growing the actual venture, right? And as a reminder, there are two other required videos for this module. Now, let's begin with this big question. And this kind of goes to my whole notion of reimagining how we do entrepreneurship. And I just want to put a quote up here from Adam Posen, who wrote this in The Economist in 2015. And it was an article about growth. Are we seeing growth in our economies like we need? And he wrote here, questioning growth is now deemed to be the act of lunatics, idealists, and revolutionaries. Yet question it we must. The mantra of growth has failed us. It has failed the 2 billion people who still live on less than $2 a day. It is damaging the fragile ecology on which we depend for survival. It has fueled our addiction to spiraling debt. Prosperity for the few, founded on financial instability, ecological destruction, and persistent social injustice, is no basis for a civilized society. Now, those are pretty strong words, but I think he's onto something here, and I want to talk about that more. I think he's got a good point that we aren't seeing the kinds of growth, and let's talk for a moment, to think for a moment about why we're not seeing, at a social or a larger level, why are we not seeing the growth that we need to maybe ensure equality and to make a good life for everyone? So let's think about this. Economists call it the growth dilemma. And in fact, in 2016, Robert Gordon, who's a very famous economist, wrote this book, The Rise and Fall of American Growth. And Paul Krugman wrote about the book, and he said that, here's a quote directly from Paul Krugman's review of the book. He, and this refers to Robert Gordon, has argued that the IT revolution is less important than any one of the 5 great inventions that powered economic growth from 1870 to 1970. And those were electricity, urban sanitation, chemicals and pharmaceuticals, the internal combustion engine, and modern communication. So clearly, Gordon is addressing this notion that we've been living in more recent years through what one has termed, or what many have termed, the IT revolution. And Gordon is saying, that's not delivering the growth that other quote unquote revolutions have. And Paul Krugman is kind of giving us that information as well. And if you break it down, there's some issues. If you look at it more carefully or read the book, you'll see that, this IT revolution has led us to focus in on kind of narrow areas of the economy in a certain sense. There's been change in social media, certainly there. Media has changed. It's become social media, and Facebook being an example of that. Retail, we now buy a lot online, Amazon being the example, and entertainment, and we can talk for days about entertainment that's been enabled through the IT revolution, right? But that stands in contrast to other sectors that might be more important, such as energy, transportation, and manufacturing. So we've seen some evolution in those sectors, but not nearly what we saw many years before, from 1870 to 1970, and that seems to be the core problematic issue, that the value of those sectors to society is probably far greater for growth because it provides far greater efficiencies and productivity. Social media, you could argue the value of social media. It has value, but you can, especially if you net it out with all the harms and dangers, maybe it's a wash. I don't know. Retail, yeah, is Amazon able to get things to us in a more efficient way? Perhaps, yeah. So there is value. But maybe greater value comes from innovation in energy breakthroughs, transportation and manufacturing, battery technologies that have been relatively slow to evolve in the last 100 years are now slowly gathering a little more steam, but that would be immense. They have immense breakthroughs in batteries, for example, would be fantastic, and we're on the cusp of some of that, but there just hasn't been as much energy put into that as there has been into social media. And of course, this has fueled inequality. And there are and this goes back to Dan Lyon's book, and we've already talked about it, but as we wrap up, I want to remind you of that. There are the techno-optimists who think that just the IT in the hands of a few entrepreneurs is going to save the world, but really, is it? We're not seeing the kind of growth we'd like to see. And as Dan Lyon pointed out, it's not gap narrowing as we would like it to be, right? It's actually gap widening in many cases. So it's not solving inequality. And I see that growth itself has a correlation with physical expansion. And the world has become a very crowded place, and we've run out of room to expand physically. And I think the underlying reason or mechanism at work is that when we expand physically into the unknown or less known, those unknown environments, which can be hostile, stimulate invention, especially with energy, transportation, and manufacturing. And when we don't have that possibility of growing into those unknown environments, perhaps we will focus more on those things that are less productive in a way: social media, retail, and entertainment. It's kind of my 2 cents. I don't have a lot of research to support this, but it comes from my intuition and understanding from having read a lot and lived a lot. And to contextualize it, we can think about this beautiful earth, and you see it up on the screen now in front of you. It is finite. The resources are finite. And it's getting very crowded. It's getting very crowded, and there's people almost on every square inch of that globe, right? And so we can continue to grow economies to a certain degree through substitution, and that is replacing dirty and harmful technologies and processes with clean technology and processes, and that can give us some growth. But I think the real growth is going to come from expansion into space, and now you see the image of the moon through the famous science fiction TV series Space 1999, one of my childhood favorites, by the way. It wasn't only Star Trek. And I think, though, the next step in our evolution is really to push forward to the moon, creating a moon base and expand, and that as a gateway for us to expand into outer space and develop commerce in outer space. And I think that will help us develop energy, transportation, and manufacturing, because it will be stimulated by those environments which are hostile to humans. But hostile environments always lead us into invention. When humans are unhappy, it goes back to the fundamentals of what causes us to invent. And we've talked about that multiple times in this course and in other courses in which I teach. When humans are unhappy with their environments and their situations, they invent. And if we're too happy, we maybe stop inventing. So putting ourselves out there, although dangerous and risky, and I don't deny that whatsoever, it is dangerous and risky, but it will be stimulative. It will help us to further innovate in areas that are productive: energy, transportation, and manufacturing. And I put, for those of you who want to know more about this notion of moving out into outer space and some of the challenges, I placed a wonderful article up on Blackboard, and it's in Learning Resources, Other Useful Resources, Outer Space Entrepreneurship. It's located in the Outer Space Entrepreneurship folder under Learning Resources and Other Useful Resources. And it's called Space, the Final Economic Frontier. And I think it's a worthwhile read if you have any interest in learning more about this. But, and some of you may say, well, this is kind of science fiction and far off. Actually, it's happening now. There are space commerce companies that are actually making progress out there. And I'm not going to go into detail about that now. But and you might ask, why, Professor, why go to the moon? Well, Jeff Bezos, through Blue Origin, has this wonderful notion that the only place that we know in the universe where humans can survive easily and comfortably is the Earth, and that we ought to think about removing all the toxic manufacturing of processes and floating it in outer space around us where it can do less damage and harm to us, or putting it on the moon. And I think the moon's a great place because the moon has very little gravity. As a result of that, it takes less energy to transport out or to transit out to asteroids and back. So we could do additive manufacturing, create things on the moon using rare earth materials that we can find on asteroids. The Earth is running out of rare earth materials that are required for battery production, for example. And by doing it up on the moon, we can create it there, and then we can drop it down to the Earth. It's easy and low cost to actually get things from the moon to the Earth. It's expensive to leave the Earth and go to the moon because of our gravity. We have immense gravity, and that causes the expense or the energy required to be very high to take something up out of our atmosphere, up off the Earth. But to drop things down to the Earth is actually relatively safe and relatively low cost. So keep that in mind. Now, one last thought about all of this, and that is we may be all tempted to think, wow, that entrepreneurship and venture capital can solve all of this on its own, but it really can't, my friends. It can't be done. What you see on the screen now is a graph of NASA's budget as a percent of GDP going back to its founding days in 1958. And if you notice on the graph, it got a huge portion of GDP in the 60s because we were intent on getting to the moon and proving that we could go there, that we could take humans there. And we as a society were willing to make those massive investments required. And you can see what's happened after we got to the moon. And today, where does it stand today? Very, very low. Very, very low. Now, you might say, well, that's because we're doing everything through venture capital. Well, venture capital and entrepreneurs are good at commercializing that which is known, but they're not good at creating new, complex, systemic information. We need big social projects like NASA or like Bell Labs. And for those of you in TIM 585, you've probably been reading about Bell Labs and learning about that. Or if you will, and when you do take TIM 585, you will. But we need those big projects as a complement to venture capitalists and entrepreneurs. So we need a complete ecosystem that consists of these big social projects, I'm going to call them, that are often government sponsored because they're complex. There's a lot of unknowns, and no one venture capitalist or individual entrepreneur can take on the amount of risk required for some of these massive projects. And just recently, we got news that the private space group from Israel failed. They crashed the probe they were trying to land on the moon. And the moon is relatively easy to land on. So it crashed, right? So once again, private enterprise cannot always solve these problems. We need these big social projects as a complement because of the nature of the undertaking. So we need a complete ecosystem with all the above, not one or the other. And so I hope we learn as a society to reinvest and to allocate more money into these big social projects that help move us forward. We are living, most of the invention of the IT sector is a byproduct of Bell Labs. So we're living off the legacy of Bell Labs, and Bell Labs was a quasi-governmental monopoly that was able to muster the energy and resources required to tackle very big problems. So we are living off that legacy, but we're depleting it, and it's time for us to create a new pool of breakthrough technologies and information from which venture capitalists and entrepreneurs can then commercialize as they do best. Now, let's move on and talk about venture growth. So let's start with this notion that growth is necessary and difficult. And a lot of research suggests that. And growth is necessary because it helps a venture develop and maintain its competitive advantage gain market share, and social impact. Without growth, you're not going to probably develop or have a strong competitive advantage. Competitive advantage is something that develops over time. It's rarely there instantly. Market share rarely is instant and needs to be developed and grown. And so does social impact, because the more people you reach, the more you will impact with your venture, your products. I think one of the best models for understanding how ventures and firms can grow is Greiner's model. I know the book, Alan uses a slightly different view, and it's useful too, but I think Greiner's model is especially useful because he addressed this notion of the difficulty of growth and the challenges to growth. And he framed them very succinctly based upon a lot of research. And I think what's wonderful about his model is that you can look to it and say, I know what to expect in this phase. And by knowing what to expect, the kind of negative challenge that can arise, you might be able to guard against it and kind of not have to directly experience the crises. So we refer to these as the crises of the firm. There are 5 phases he has. The first one is called creativity, and one encounters the leadership crisis. The next one is called direction, and in that you encounter the autonomy crisis. The third one is delegation, and there's the control crisis. The fourth one is coordination, and there's the red tape crisis. And the last one is collaboration, and that leads us to the growth crisis. Now, I'm not going to explain these 5 phases. I've included another video that it's required that goes into depth explaining each one of these phases and the complexities of the crisis most firms will encounter. Now, do you have to encounter that crisis? No. You can proactively guard against it. You can take proactive action so that you can make the transition. But all of these represent what we refer to as punctuated equilibrium. When you encounter the crisis, it means the venture has drifted out of equilibrium or out of balance with its environment, and the crisis emerges. And if you're successful in addressing the crisis and solving it, you bring the firm back into equilibrium. And that's punctuating the punctuated equilibrium. And this refers to the work that we address in TIM 585. TIM 585 is all about addressing changes to the firm and the need to keep the firm in equilibrium with its environment. And so this is a great departure point for you to refer back to the information you've learned or will learn in TIM 585. Just want to remind you of that. Make sure you watch the video to learn more about how to address each one of these crises as they arise or before they arise. Our textbook, Alan's textbook, does give us information about growth phases. She has broken it into 4 phases: the startup phase, early growth, high growth, and stable growth. And the book addresses the needs, the kind of requirements for the firm during each one of those phases. In the startup phase, there's a big need for capital, customers, and distribution. Those seem to be the priorities. Under early growth, the priorities are cash flow and marketing. Then when we go into higher growth, the priorities become resources, growth capital, and management. And then under stable growth, the priorities are innovation, maintaining success. So you can read more about that in the book. I'm not going to go into detail about that because I think they're pretty straightforward, and it integrates a lot of what you've already learned throughout the business curriculum. Now, let's focus in on growth strategies. And typically, we think of growth strategies as breaking into 3 broad categories or baskets. The first one is called growing the market, and that involves market exploitation or exploration. The next one is growing in the industry, and that involves vertical expansion or horizontal expansion or alliances. And the last one is going global, and that involves alliances, agents, and intermediaries. And I'm going to talk a little bit about each one of these just to make sure we're aware of it. And let's start with growing the market. So the idea here is that you want to capture adjacent markets beyond your first market. So you have your first group of customers. Now you want to reach out to other customer groups because you want to get more people to buy your product, right? You want to grow. And this means you have to constantly monitor and refine the business model. And you know that already. This is the lean approach, constantly proposing hypotheses and getting new data, new information, and refining and refining and refining. And of course, you need to focus in on your marketing strategy and making sure that that marketing strategy evolves as well and enables you to execute that business model properly. And there are two ways that we can kind of, grow in the market. One is through exploitation. The other one is through exploration. I'm going to talk about each one of those. Exploitation is when you sell more to more of the same target. So it's selling the same product effectively to more of similar types of customers. So you're going to increase your sales through more effective marketing. So you're going to get better at marketing and therefore be able to reach more of similar kinds of people with pretty much the same product that you have now. Now, exploration is a little bit different. The idea here is to sell more to other targets. So we're going to be a little bit less focused on improving marketing, but rather we're going to think about, are there new variations or new products that are variants that might appeal to slightly different targets as a way of growing? Or do we want to pursue new channels of distribution, new ways of getting that product out? And a couple examples of those would be franchising and licensing. Those are examples of how you might go about exploration, strategies of exploration. And again, you can read the book to get more information about this. Now, let's move on and talk about growing within the industry. And this is typically referred to corporate level strategy because at this point, you may grow through adding other companies. So you become a corporation. So you've been successful as a business. Now you want to branch out and have separate businesses. Just a moment ago, what we talked about, the exploration, was really about adding new product lines. Now we're talking about adding new businesses. And that makes it a corporate level kind of approach. You do this primarily through acquisitions. And you want acquisitions that integrate well with your core business, that complement or integrate well with it, that can be implemented quickly and won't disable your smooth operations, essentially. You want to be aware of that. And the book, again, gives you much more detail about this. Entrepreneurs typically use three strategies to grow within the industry. One is vertical integration, the next is horizontal integration, and the last one is alliance strategies. And I'm going to talk a bit about each one of these. So vertical integration strategies, and this is really where we focus in on either going backward or forward in the industry supply chain. We call that vertical because you're getting further integrated with either upstream or downstream businesses. And when you do, we call it a backward strategy or backward vertical integration strategy when you buy or gain control of your supplier. So the upstream folks or behind you are the backward strategy, just to kind of make it clear. And of course, you could start a supply business as well. Now, a forward vertical integration strategy is when you focus in on buying or developing distribution. So you're going downstream, getting closer to the customer or the end user. We would call that a forward vertical integration strategy. And a full vertical integration strategy. And some corporations are fully vertically integrated. That means you own supply, you are the focal firm, you own the focal firm, and you own distribution as well. And I worked for a company that was fairly vertically integrated years ago. Tesla is an example of a somewhat vertically integrated corporation. There's the car company, there's the battery company, a supplier. There is the solar company, which is, kind of more horizontal, I think, actually. And then there is distribution. They own distribution as well. They don't use a dealer network. They go direct through their website and sell direct to consumers. So they're somewhat vertically integrated. Now, horizontal integration is when you buy similar competitors or you start a competing business. That's known as horizontal integration. Car companies are a great example of horizontal integration, or they offer us the possibility of a great example of horizontal integration. And I want to talk about Ford for a moment. So let's think about the Ford corporation. It owns different car businesses. One of those car businesses is the Ford Car Company. You'll see an example on the screen there. Of course, that's from the early 1950s. I thought it'd be fun to do it from a different time period. And that was a car that was targeted towards the low price field. So it was an affordable car. The Fords are known for being affordable. Next, we would have the Mercury Car Company. And Mercury was a mid-priced car aiming for those people that were pre-luxury, so we're somewhere in between economy and luxury. And then, of course, Ford also offered the Lincoln Continental, correct? And that would have been the fine car field, as they called it in the day, or the luxury segment, as we call it today. So each one is a separate business, but they're all cars, and they fulfill a different target audience or a different niche need. Now, could you also extend this to complementary businesses? Yes. So Ford has a credit company. That is a part of their horizontal piece as well. Credit company then is something that people use to also buy the car. So they're very complementary. So there's an example of horizontal integration. Now let's talk about alliance strategies. And this is another way to grow your company. And in some ways, it's easier because you simply let somebody else do what they do well, and you do what you do well. Just have to make the agreement. And you do this by forming alliances or partnerships with entities that offer some capability or product that you need, or the possibility. So the capability is really the possibility that together you could make a product or enter a market that you'd like to get into. Maybe you have some of the capabilities needed, but not all of them. And so you'd want to partner with them for that. Or maybe they have a particular product that would be a nice complementary add-on to your product, and that in the market, those two together would offer more value to customers than the two do on their own. And of course, managing a alliance really is less work and coordination interaction than a merger, but certainly more than a licensing agreement. So it's somewhere in between. And we usually form an alliance through the joint venture mechanism. They're used to develop new technologies, conduct research, produce products, or co-market products. So lots of different ways that you can enact a joint venture. But again, it offers you a lot of flexibility, more so than, say, self-developing or, just licensing. Now, let's talk about growing by going global. The question today is, when should we go global? Years ago, the question was, should we go global? But today, it's pretty much a given in today's world that there's a lot of opportunity outside of our own home markets, and why not tap into that opportunity? Some entrepreneurs are born global, or their ventures are born global, meaning that in the beginning, they aim to be global companies. They see the potential. The technical definition for born global means that you sold at least 25% of your revenues in the first 3 years come from international marketplace and so forth, right? So interesting proposition. If you can do it, very interesting, despite trade wars and other issues that may exist among countries, still could be very viable and interesting to do that. There's been a lot of research on going global and successful global startups, and there are kind of 7 key characteristics that we see when we look upon these successful startups that go global. One is that they start with a global vision. They want to be international or global from day one. Number 2 is that the managers within, or the leaders within the venture have international experiences and international connections, and also have an international business network. That's point 3 on the screen. 4 is that the technology typically that sells best internationally is what we call preemptive technology. Proactively, it helps organizations or others proactively avoid problems. So very predictive and so forth. Point 5 is that you have, or the venture that is going global has very unique know-how, typically. Very unique know-how that isn't easily replicated by others, and that makes their competitive advantage more sustainable, of course. Point 6 is that the products and service extensions are closely linked, so there's lots of possibilities for service extensions stemming off of the product that you're selling internationally. And point 7 is that there's close coordination on a worldwide basis, so that you probably keep it relatively lean and do a lot of close coordination, probably not licensing initially. So those are the 7 characteristics. Just a little reminder, going global is obviously risky. Building a foreign customer base and distribution network is challenging, and you'll need to work probably through agents and intermediaries to do so. And of course, financing is more difficult, mostly because of currency fluctuation, but for other reasons as well. The book does a great job of describing going global, so you ought to definitely dig into the book here and look at that. Now, I just want to wrap up with a couple different points, tips, if you will, about growing as you move from conception into more maturity, growing through those phases. One is leadership. We know that leadership succession is absolutely necessary, and certainly it sometimes happens sooner, sometimes later. And if you go back to the grinder model, there will be leadership challenges and crises that occur, and no company can count on keeping the same team in place over the life of the business. So evolution of the team makes sense because we need different kinds of leadership depending on the phase in which the company sits today, right? So succession planning becomes very important. That means identifying people who can take over as other people phase out. So you want to have a plan in place and maybe be grooming people to move up into the ranks as the organization grows. Very important to do that. And the book talks about that in more detail. The last point I want to make is planning for harvest and exit. Usually when we do a startup, there is some idea that at some point we'll harvest the goodness we've created as individuals or people that are participating in that early venture and make an exit. It doesn't necessarily mean that you have to stop being an entrepreneur. You can take the financial rewards without stopping being an entrepreneur. You know, there's a thing called a serial entrepreneur, or a type of entrepreneur called serial, and they love to start businesses, sell them, and then start another. And Elon Musk is one, and there's plenty of them out there. So that's an option as well, too, that you just see yourself as someone who invents businesses, sells them, and then maybe takes the proceeds and starts others. You should have, though, it's always a good idea when we do a startup, is to have some idea of how you plan on harvesting rewards and exiting. Just some notion. And again, the book gives you plenty of ideas about that. And some of the other lectures we've had have spoken to this issue of exiting. How does one exit? So, my friends, I want to wrap up now. There are, as I said earlier, 2 more required videos. One that goes in depth on Grinder's model of growth, and another one that speaks generically to the life cycles of a firm. Both are very valuable, and I think you ought to watch those. And also, I put up for fun an episode of Space 1999 and an episode of UFO, another childhood favorite of mine. If you have time, I think they're fun to watch. And certainly if you like 1960s purple hair and mod styles, you're going to love UFO. So they're actually in the module folder there for you for fun to watch if you feel so inclined to do so. Well, my friends, I thank you as usual, and we will have time for a final wrap-up when we meet for this final module. We will be meeting in person for the final module, but make sure that you, as usual, review the syllabus in DGA, and make sure that you've looked at the information in the detailed schedule for modules to make sure that you're on top of everything that needs to be done to complete the course in good fashion. Thank you.